Hello, my dear students. Welcome again this week to our biology class. This week we'll be looking at the topic pollination in plants. And in our learning objective this week, we have the first one to define the term pollination. Number two, to describe the two types of pollination. We'll also look at the features of self-pollination. And we will also describe the features of cross-pollination too. And we will still look at the agents of pollination. These are the objectives of our lesson this week. So at the end of this lesson, make sure that you will capture these stated objectives. Let's look at our key vocabularies. We have our key vocabularies as follows. We have the first one, pollination. We have the second one, xenogamy. We have orthogamy. We have heterogamy. We have homogamy. We have cleistogamy. We have dichogamy. We have protandry. We have protogeny. We have dioecious. We have monoecious. We have entomophily. We have anemophily. And we have unisexual. If you are able to capture these terms at the end of this lesson, which means that you have actualized the objectives of this lesson, I implore you to get used to these terms, especially JAMB candidates. Get used to these terms, they are very necessary. Okay, let's go to our lesson. Let's look at what pollination is. Pollination is defined as the transfer of mature pollen grain from the anthers of one flower to the mature stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant or closely related species. We can easily say that is defined as the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to a receptive stigma. Pollen grains are immobile, so they can not move, they can't swim, they cannot reach the stigma by themselves. They always need an external agent for this to happen. So this external agent can be wind, it can be water, it can be animal, it can be gravity or growth contact. Something must necessitate the movement of the anthers to reach the stigma. The transfer of the pollen grain from the anther of a flower to the stigma. We have two types of pollination. We have self-pollination and the cross-pollination. Another name for cross-pollination is what we call xenogamy. Either we call it cross-pollination or technically we call it xenogamy. Let's look at self-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. Look at the definition very well. You understand here that with this definition, it brings about two major types of self-pollination. One is transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. This transferring of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. If you look at this, you will see that this thing is a typical flower. The pollen grain is moving from this anther to the stigma of the same flower. This type of self-pollination is what we call orthogamy. Why the second one is the one that we have here. The anther moves from the pollen grains move from the anther to the stigma of another flower, but of the same plant. The pollen grain will move from here, it will come and land on the stigma here. This is a typical plant, but it has numerous flowers. So the pollen grain moving from one flower to another brings about the second type of self-pollination that we call gaetonogamy. Gaetonogamy and the autogamy, these are the two types of self-pollination that we have. The autogamy involves transfer of pollen grain from anther to the stigma of the same flower, while gaetonogamy involves the transfer of pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. These are the two types of self-pollination. Now let's look at features of self-pollination. What are the features of self-pollination? The first one, we have homogamy. In homogamy, it refers to the ripening of the anthers and the stigma of a bisexual flower at the same time. When the anther and the stigmas of a bisexual flower matures at the same time, this brings about the term we call homogamy. Now, homogamy promotes self-pollination. Without homogamy, self-pollination will be hindered. Why? Because pollinating agents can readily carry mature pollen grain from mature anthers to the receptive stigma. Again, the filament of the anthers may recoil. You can see recoiling of the filament. They can bend over since the anthers are matured and the stigmas are also matured. So if they can bend over, bringing the anthers near the stigmas, so the anthers if can easily burst at this moment, and if they burst, they can discharge the pollen grains directly on the stigmatic surfaces. Immediately they bend there, they can easily burst and discharge the pollen grains into the stigma. We have some flowers like Mirabilis flower. Some species of the stigma recoils to touch the matured anthers. Hibiscus flower, this happens so much there. Even sunflower, this process also occurs there. Some flowers like periwinkle flower and Isura flower, you see that some of these tubular flowers, the anthers are arranged at the mouth of the corolla. This happens in a way that if the carpels mature, the stigmas push their way out through the tube, brushing against the mature anthers, and in their process, pollen grains are collected immediately. These are as a result of homogamy, because these two structures, the anthers and the stigma, both of them matured at the same time. And we have the second one, cleistogamy. In cleistogamy is a condition in which pollen grains are discharged directly onto the receptive stigma of closed flowers. The pollen grains, they are discharged onto the receptive stigma of closed flowers. In cleistogamous flowers, the anthers they dehisce inside closed flowers. Growth of style brings the pollen grains in contact with stigma. So pollination and seed set are assured through this process. Pollinating agents are not required. There's no need of pollinators here, because these pollen grains are discharged directly onto the receptive stigma of closed flowers. So there is no need of pollinating agent, because this structure enables pollination to occur automatically. The second type of pollination, cross-pollination. Another name for cross-pollination is what we call xenogamy or allogamy. Either we call it xenogamy or we call it allogamy. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another plant of the same species. Transfer of pollen grain from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower, probably another plant but of the same species. Here you have two different plants where their gametes are being transferred. Pollen grains will be transferred from the anther to the stigma of another plant. This is the one we call cross-pollination. In cross-pollination, it brings about greater genetic variability among the offsprings, because this can lead to healthy and well adapted offsprings to be developed, because here you have mixture, you have combination of genetic materials of different organisms. They can produce abundant and viable seeds because of this combination of genetic materials. Or even on the other hand, they can even introduce apart crops with resistant varieties. It's known that it's a risk and wasteful process, since most pollen grains may never reach the receptive stigma. But it's more preferable than the self-pollination, because self-pollination, when it occurs several times, when it occurs, it may result in weakened offsprings. But in cross-pollination, you have viable and strong seeds, viable and strong offspring developing as a result of recombination of genes within different organisms but of the same species. We have features that facilitate cross-pollination. First one, we have dichogamy. Dichogamy refers to the ripening of the anthers and stigmas of a bisexual flower at different times. Here now, this happens at different times. Dichogamy, where the anthers and the stigmas they ripe at different times. Now it's not like the homogamy. This is just opposite of homogamy. It's not a situation where the anthers and the stigma will ripe at the same time. No, here they ripe at different times. It occurs in two forms. Number one, protandry, and two, protogeny. Now, what is protandry? Protandry refers to the condition in which the anther of a flower mature earlier than the stigma of that flower or other flowers of the same plant. Here, the anthers in protandry, the anthers matures earlier than the stigmas. While in protogeny, the stigmas matures earlier than the anthers, just opposite of protandry. Protandry, the anthers matures earlier than the stigmas of that flower or flowers of the same plant. We have some example of flowers that this occur in sunflower, okra, cotton. They exhibit this condition, protandry. While in protogeny, the stigmas of a flower mature earlier than its anthers. In palm trees, figs, this protogeny occurs. The stigmas they mature earlier than the anthers. The second feature here is the unisexuality in dioecious plants. In dioecious plants like pawpaw, only cross-pollination can occur because the male and female are born on separate plants. That's when we say unisexuality in dioecious plants. Dioecious plants are plants that the male and female sex organ or gametes are born on different plants. Remember die, which means two. They are born on different plants. The anthers are born on different plants, while the stigmas are born on different plants. So if you see a particular plant like this, that particular plant will probably bear the male gamete, while another plant will bear the female gamete.
So you see that we have two different plants that bear two different gametes. That's a dioecious plant. This another one is unisexuality in monoecious plant. Monoecious is opposite of dioecious plant. Both male and female flowers are born together. In that particular plant, you will see the anthers there, you see the stigmas there. A particular plant that possesses both male and female flowers. While dioecious plant, we have plant that they possess only one, another plant will possess the other one. If you look at the flower of a dioecious plant will only have either the anther. You meet another plant, it will have the stigma. But here you have a plant that has both the anther and the stigma. We have self-incompatibility as another feature that facilitates cross-pollination. Self-sterility or incompatibility, it happens as a result that a flower do not germinate on the stigma of the same flower, maybe due to the presence of similar self-sterile genes. Maybe that particular flower have some sterile genes that it cannot be able to germinate with that particular one. In tobacco, potato, the crucifers, we have them as some of the plants that exhibit this self-incompatibility. A situation that a bisexual flower may bear a mature stamen and carpels at the same time, but the pollen grains fall on the stigma at that same time, but it will not fertilize. They will fail to germinate. This condition is always inherited. It brings about self-incompatibility because they have developed some sterile genes that they cannot be able to be compatible with their opposite gamete. That is this self-incompatibility. These are the features of cross-pollination. Now let's look at the agents of pollination. Because that pollination in flowers is dependent on external pollinating agents or pollinators, and these pollinating agents are wind, water, insects, and animals. A flower that depends on the wind, we say that that flower is anemophily or anemophilous flower. A flower that depends on water, we say that that flower is hydrophily or hydrophilous flower. A flower that depends on insect, we say that that flower is entomophily. Entomology, from entomology, entomophily or entomophilous flower. While the ones that depends on animal, we say that they are zoophily or zoophilous flowers. Out of all these agents of pollination, the most common pollinators are always the wind and the insects. They are the most common pollinators, and we'll be considering these two because of our study, the wind and the insect. Let's look at characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. Insects visit flower not to pollinate them, but the major reason is that they will go there to obtain nectar and pollen as their food. So insect pollinated flower, or they are always called entomophilous flowers, as I've said earlier. Example of insect that pollinate flowers are bees, wasps, butterflies, moths, even ants. They also play this role. And majority of the flower, not all flowers are being pollinated by insects. We have some flowers that are being pollinated by insects like hibiscus flower, Dilonyx regia, cowpea, crotalaria, pride of Barbados, flamboyant flower, sunflower, and the orchid. These are some of the flowers that are being pollinated by insects. So whenever we talk about the mechanism of insect pollinating this flower, it involves about the insect visiting the flower in search of food. And during this time, the insect is becoming covered with pollen from matured anthers. When it's being covered by food, the insect flying to another flower of the same species, where some of the pollen on its body will become rubbed off. When they are being rubbed off, they fall onto the stigma of that flower or another flower but of the same plant, or of the same plant of the same species, thereby bringing about cross pollination. Now, the characteristics, we have the first one as flowers that are insect pollinated. They are large and conspicuous. They are visible. They are clear. They are large. Now, they are also bisexual. They are bisexual flowers. The flowers, they are brightly colors that attract the insect. They have the presence of scent. They have good scent and produce nectar from nectaries. They also have a rough and sticky pollen grains, but these pollen grains, they are always few in number. The stigma is flat with sticky surface that will always enable it to receive the pollen grain as quick as possible. The flowers also usually show elaborate structural modification that is suitable for insect pollinator. Some of this structural modification is that some of them, they have a hollow stigma that will always enable any small pollen grain to fall into the style immediately, so that fertilization can occur, so that most of the pollen grain will not be wasted. These are some of the characteristics of insect pollinated flowers. Wind pollination. Wind pollinated flowers are called anemophilous flowers, as I have said earlier. Examples include maize, guinea grass, rice, millet, and wheat. Generally, wind pollinated flowers are majorly grasses. The principal plants that they pollinate are mainly grasses. So we have some of these characteristics as number one, the flowers, they are always small and inconspicuous. You can hardly see them. They are very, very small. Because of their size facilitates so that the wind can be able to carry them around. The flowers also are unisexual. The flowers are usually dull colored. There's no significant role that colors are going to play here, because it's the wind that is acting as a pollinator. So it doesn't have any biological significance of the colors of having a colored flower. There is no scent or nectaries here, and pollen grains are small, smooth, light, not sticky, and are produced in huge quantities, because wind pollination is a wasteful process. Majority of them will be dispersed. They won't follow the stigma. The wind will carry a lot of them away. So they are always small, light, in a way that the wind can be able to carry them. And apart from that too, the stigma is always elongated and sticky with large surface area, so that it can be able to receive the pollen grains too. And the flower structure of wind pollinated flowers, the flower structure is simple, usually with one or more floral parts absent. They have a small flower structure that has either one or more floral parts being absent. These are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers. Having known what pollination is, having understood the different types of pollination and the features of this type of pollination, different agents of pollination, and the some basic vocabularies in pollination in flowering plants, I implore you to visit your assignment and do more research on pollination in flowering plants as we end our lesson this week here. Thank you so much.